Now, this is a topic which is almost too natural for me, because in many ways it's part 2 of my book. It's what happens after daring class to the large fleet destroyer. You see, you have a natural successor to the daring, which is basically daring, slightly bigger, with missiles added on. And then, well, longer term, you have the Type 82. And coming up, you have the Type 83. And this video will talk about all of these vessels. It really will. Because Royal Naval destroyers in transition, daring to county class, well, to me that felt like half the story. That felt like half the history. So, as good as Paul Harvey's question is, the evolution of the Royal Navy destroyer from the daring to the county, including the cruiser destroyer ideas, and I'm going to be looking into a lot of those, I didn't feel it went far enough. I felt I could do more. I felt the topic deserved more. I really did. And so... Sorry, my dog's been in here licking this chair again. I did oil it, believe it or not. You can tell when I've oiled it. I have mildly quietest videos where the thing doesn't squeak, and very quickly it does start squeaking again. And I've got to find something which is safe so if he does lick it he doesn't make him ill, but something he doesn't like the taste of. And I even tried one which was an apple vinegar based one. I'm sorry about this, I know I'm explaining far too much, but let me explain. An apple vinegar based one, which dogs aren't supposed to like. They're not supposed to like the apple vinegar. Well, I can tell you, my poodle and my corgi both like it. So, I have weird dogs. We'll just leave it at that. And at some point, I will find something which I can use. But this book, Rebuilding the Royal Navy, Warship Design since 1945 by D.K. Brown and Roger Moore. It's been a pretty useful book for me in this particular video when I'm putting everything together because it's a good starting point. Do I agree with everything in here? No. But mostly my disagreements with this in here are because, well, as I've talked about before on this channel, my dad was a naval architect. And this really, a lot of the ships in here are his generation of ships, which he worked on. And if you consider the last ship he was involved in design with has yet to enter service. He's been dead a few years, but Type 26 was the last program he was involved in. Has yet to enter service, and he starts work in the late 1940s in naval design. You can guess how long he was involved. He was one of the first pioneers to work with computer testing and computer-developed design assistant tools for ship design. And he was the guy who was still well into his late 80s, early 90s, must have been. Yeah, was still being called in as the person, what, we don't think what the computer's telling us is right. That was fun. Occasionally I would go with him to those trips. As his chauffeur slash assistant slash person who was generally interested, and he felt like he was always asked, do you need to bring an assistant along? And he'd go, no, he usually just turned up himself, but then he realised that he could get a trip for his son around a shipyard, and his son enjoyed the shipyard, so he'd go, yes, I have an assistant. It was very fun when it was a 14-year-old boy turning up. But leaving that to one side, that means that whilst I use that book a lot, and I do recommend it, as a good starting point, I don't agree with everything in it. Okay, I highly recommend getting it. Do I agree with everything in it? No. Do they do a good job? Yes. But I have my own perspective, which is informed by my own research and my own experience with my dad. So, yeah, and my mum as well, who, though she was more towards to do with civilian shipping in her experience. So, we start off with the Daring class, which are the last of the Henderson line of big destroyers. And they really are the last of the Henderson line of big destroyers. I kid you not, sometimes when I want to be really picky over this design. I overlay the designs I have for his L-70 proposal from prior to World War II over the Daring class. And to say they look damn near identical is to understate it. And excuse the strong language there, but it's true. And I know why they do. Because the guy who leads the design of these, and who oversees their design and development, is the guy who oversaw the design development of Henderson's large fleet destroyers, Stanley Goodall. And they are being designed with a similar precipice in mind, a similar idea in mind. These are the large destroyers which can fill in for cruisers when you need them to. Darings are actually deployed places when cruisers are in shortage. When there's a shortage of cruisers, they deploy a Daring. These are gun destroyers. Yes, they are armed with torpedoes. They are big, powerful destroyers. But more importantly, they are vessels which are prestigious enough, powerful enough, and presenceful enough that they can stand in for cruisers. And even on their design form, you can tell that. When Churchill was looking at a Daring class on the design, when he was told that, oh well, this ship, when this ship comes into service, it's going to be on the rotor to replace this ship in a few years' time. He went, send me the design. I won't give permission. He was Prime Minister at the time. I won't give permission if it's not good enough. He looked at design and nothing more was said. He accepted it. These ships were built around the fighting capability of the 4.5-inch gun and its air defense capability. They are in many ways the peak of the gun destroyer in the Royal Navy, and arguably there are a couple of other classes which share it, say the Smallands as well, the peak of the gun destroyer globally. Yes, they're armed with torpedoes, but these are big, powerful ships. Fast, mean. Everything you need to escort your carrier battle groups, everything you need to fight your battles in what was a world transitioning into a Cold War. However, there was a small issue. The day of the gun as the be-all and end-all, rather than a useful weapon, but as the primary, principal weapon, was numbered. The days of the gun were changing. They were changing. Which is what makes the next slide quite so appropriate, because this is the discussions which go between. This is actually a page from the book I showed you earlier. And you start looking at designs and you go, well, that looks like an enlarged Daring. Definitely modified Daring. Elongated, slightly modified, a more modified Daring. Okay, they've gone for a slightly different hull, but they're actually going for a more style hull. Okay, so what's happening in this? What is going on? Well, missiles are coming in. And missiles are a complication. Especially when you know already that the first generation missiles are going to be terrible. And this is the funny thing with the British. They know the first generation missiles are going to be terrible. They do. They're literally designing the ships for the Sea Slug and the Sea Cat and this, knowing they are developing and starting the road down towards the Sea Wolf and the Sea Dart. They know their first generation missiles are basically, we've got missiles. Do they work? Probably. But we've got them. It's one of the things I love about the Royal Navy in this post-World War II period. They're dealing with the rundown, but they've got enough experience when it comes to procurement that when it comes to the early missiles, they're pretty much the only ones procuring the systems going, we know the first generation are going to be complete and utter ship. We know they're going to be complete another ship. We're not pretending they're going to be anything else, but they're the first generation missiles. We'll either improve them or build something better. But the thing is, we get them into service. And the reason they're going to be shipped is because until you actually deploy them, until you're actually using them, they're all theoretical. And using them from a ship is very different than using them from land. Now, the really interesting thing for the British was that they didn't have cruisers to do this in. Britain had been a cruiser navy. It really was a cruiser navy. 1920s and 30s, the Royal Navy was a cruiser navy. Honestly, the Royal Navy, by terms of ship number, the ship quantity, was always a cruiser navy. Once it got past the initial early ironclad phase before we got to steelclad. So I'm talking about the ages of Warrior. HMS Warriors of the 1860s to 1880s period. And even in that period, let's be honest, Warrior was a battle ship in that she was part of the battle line, but she was a ironclad frigate. In simple terms, if you'd been talking about something which occasionally wandered into the battle line, which probably shouldn't have in its period, but in case of Warrior should, because compared to what it was against, and from the frigate era, you'd be going, well, hang on, that's, let's be honest, that's probably a rasée. But if you're going forward, well, if you're talking something which ends up in the battle line, but is more orientated around cruising duties, that would be a battle cruiser. One word. Please note, one word. I have, in other videos, I've talked about the development of the battle cruiser 2-word, battle cruiser 1-word, the fast battleship, and the battleship, and how they sit on this lovely spectrum, and, you know, where you can find designs in them, and how that spectrum actually evolves over time, because what you can build in certain time periods, especially power density, changes. Oh, yeah. That's what we're sort of talking about in that period. But here the Royal Navy is going, well, realistically, we don't want to build a cruiser yet, and we don't want to modify any existing cruisers because we need them in service. We do want a missile cruiser, but we don't want to build one yet until we're sure about the missile systems. So what we want to do is we want to build a destroyer which can status-wise fill in for some of the cruiser roles, because our cruisers are getting older, can carry missiles, but is also still effective, even if the missiles turn out to be even worse than we think they're going to be. Meet the County class. Meet the County class. This is literally what we're talking about, what the Royal Navy's getting to. They are working through a series of designs. They start from this, the gun-based vessel, the gun-based system, and they move from there through these design evolutions to this, the County class. Batch 1 and Batch 2. Batch 1 here is HMS London. You can see the 2 twin 4.5-inch guns forward. Batch 2, HMS Antrim. They've replaced some of the guns, well, one set of twin 4.5-inch guns, with 4 exocets. Useful. Useful, certainly. But realistically, the counties also step up in certain other ways. They have space of flag officers, which are things that Type 42s don't have. This is the weird thing you have to explain sometimes. The Type 42 is actually, in many ways, a step down from the County class. Let me explain that. The Type 40, let's observe Type 42 actually. Type 42 displaces about 4,500 tons fully loaded, and batches 1 and 2. Batch 3, it's about 5,500 tons. Okay? Fully loaded. About. The County class, they displace 6,200 tons. They are bigger than the 42s. A lot bigger. And then if we look at the Darings, well, the Darings are about 3,820 tons fully loaded. Simply put, the Darings displace almost as much as the Type 42s. And the Darings are, let's be honest, 2.5 generations earlier in destroyer design. Why? What's the differential here? Because the County class were conceived not just with having the Sea Slug, not just with having these missile systems, but also to have capabilities for operating helicopters, capabilities for accommodating a staff, capabilities for being a useful ship. They were filling in for the cruiser role. And this is another reason why they have the size and the breadth they do. They are able to fill in status and presence. Realistically, and this is to be honest, the Sea Slug is only really useful against things like the Badger and the Bear, the Tu-16 and Tu-95. And realistically, some of the aircraft, when they're improved with better systems, yeah, the beam riding Sea Slug is not a good system to engage them. But the Counties stay around. Why? Because they're still useful as present ships. Until the next generation of present ships come in, they're useful. And one of the things that happens that is worthwhile considering this whole period is that when they're looking at the missile systems, they also look at potentially upgrading the Daring class. They decide against it. They don't do with them what happens with the Swedish Småland class. Well, that was things like Småland. I think she's a Holland class. Sorry, I sometimes get them confused because Småland's the one I've been around of the vessels, and she's lovely and she's preserved in Copenhagen, well worth a visit. But it's the Holland class because Holland and Småland were the two which were actually built of the original four. Lapland and Värmland were both cancelled, and of course the other two which were actually built for the Colombian Navy of the Holland class, they're 7 de Augustus, 7 of August, and 20 de Julio, 20th of July. And yeah, I have interesting names. But when you look at them, if you go aboard the Småland and you go and look at her, you'll find that she has been converted over time. She's had missiles added on top of torpedo launchers, all sorts of things added onto her. The Darings don't get that. Why? Because A, the Navy's being run down to an extent, and B, because the Royal Navy, when they're looking at it and looking at the missile systems they're going to install, and what they probably want is an air defense missile because they've got aircraft from aircraft carriers, they've got submarines. They're not so worried about other things necessarily for the ship. They look at it and go, well, to install the Sea Slug system is going to take up a lot of space. It's easier to build these to take on the role. And that's what they do. And in fact, in many ways, the County class are defined by the need to replace the Darings in their duties. The Royal Navy had 8 Darings in service. They would keep those vessels in service for quite a while. They'd be very useful for quite a while. And then they'd be replaced by the 8 Counties, which came into service, well, respectfully, about a decade after the Darings did. In some cases, 2 decades afterwards. Antrim and Norfolk were only commissioned in 1970. And they are useful ships. The Counties, I cannot emphasize how useful they were. The other interesting thing to do with the Counties, though, is that rather like the Darings, which they used to trial out various systems in terms of their electric power supply, so the 8 ships have 4 different combinations of power supply. Okay? So you have 2 ships each with each combination. And so they could test out these different combinations of power supply and the bearings to work out what is the system we need to implement for the future, which is the best option. AC, DC, what kind of power load, all these sort of things were tested out on the ships by doing 2 in each combination. So that allowed you insurance against, well, what happens if it doesn't work on a ship just because of the way that ship handles or something that happens to that ship? When actually that's the best system, but it was something freak which went wrong. This is why you do it in multiples. The County class, well, they have the combined gas turbine and steam turbine system, the COSAG propulsion. And COSAG is an interesting system. It is an interesting system, and implementing it on a ship was pretty much used in the Royal Navy for the County class and the Tribal class, so they could test out the first generation of gas turbines. Check out if they worked. Decide whether they were going to be a long-term thing. Because, again, it's kind of insurance. We've put in a gas turbine, we put on a steam turbine. If the gas turbine doesn't work, the steam turbine will still make the ship move. So we're fine, and we're not going to look like complete flops. If the gas turbine does work, though, then we have a gas turbine. And we can move on from things. Interestingly enough, and I will say this is interestingly enough when we consider the next generation of destroyer, which I'm going to talk about, the Type 82, as we get there. Well, the Type 82 is also COSAG. Why? Because by the time you get to the Type 82, the Royal Navy's going, actually, this system has some advantages. It has some advantages. It gives us power and it gives us range. Because we've managed to make the gas turbines very good at giving us very high power when we want it. And we've managed to make the steam turbines incredibly efficient at giving us long range. Incredibly efficient at that. But in the County class, they're put in largely because everyone's looking at the gas turbines and going, will they work, will they not, will they work, will they not, will they work, will they not? And one of the reasons I would argue that they were thinking about that was because, well, if you consider what you're doing with the turbines, you're hooking a turbine direct drive up to a reduction gearbox, up to various forms of clutches, which goes to another gearbox, which then goes to the propeller and down the shaft. And the reason you do it that way is because you also have on the same propeller, that combination gearbox has also got another clutch, 2 clutches connecting into it, 2 clutched drives, which goes to another reduction gearbox, which is connected to the steam turbine. And so you have a lot of complexity in terms of gearboxes in there. And that's a lot of chances to lose energy. But realistically, this ship is the first of what was the Royal Navy was thinking about was for its next generation, its future, how it was perceiving itself. And the Royal Navy was sort of adjusting, okay? It was going, are we going to be a cruiser navy? No. A frigate navy doesn't work for us at this point. They're not big enough. A destroyer navy might work. And it's always an interesting point to me again that instead of pushing through a cruiser, they went with the County class destroyer. And yes, there is all sorts of things about Mountbatten, the politics he plays around with it, and yes, Mountbatten does get involved in it, but realistically, this is more his third Sea Lord at the time. This is more the work of the officers of the generation who'd served through World War II, who had enough experience with the Royal Navy prior to World War II to understand what the Royal Navy had been doing itself prior to World War II to try and deliver on the presence which their politicians were still demanding. And by Third Sea Lord, I'm talking about Peter Reed, Michael Lefano, and Horace Law. Those 3 officers, all admirals, are who dominate Royal Navy construction from 56 to 70. And they do a really good job of trying to make sure the Royal Navy is getting good quality designs that deliver on what they need to do. It's a constant struggle though, but they're working through it. And as you can see from these design studies, this is how the Royal Navy's thinking evolves. It's guns for the new Fleet Fast Escort, which is what they were originally calling it. Then guns and missiles. Then how much work are these missiles going to take to support them? And oh yeah, helicopters as well are probably going to be coming in. So how do we get this working? What are we using as a director for our missiles, and how are we functioning that in, and all these systems? And that's what you get built. That is what you get come about. Good-looking ships. The counties were good-looking ships. That being said, Shameless Book Plug time. Shameless Book Plug. Well, thank you for watching. Thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing, helping the channel grow. Hope you're enjoying these videos. Recording all before I go to Japan, and well, when I'm in if I'm lucky enough to get to Japan, I still say if, because when I'm recording them, the money hasn't come in from the house sale, the money hasn't come in from the fundraising, none of that's yet sorted those things out. So it's always an if. If I'm lucky enough to get to Japan, it'll all be thanks to you. When a new book comes out, they'll all be thanks to you. All the things I'm managing to do with this history channel, with all the stuff, is thanks to you and your support, your kindness, your assistance. So thank you. Now, if all that's been said, now you've got the counties in service, you're getting this data from the missiles you have in service, and you start planning for a proper future. And the Royal Navy starts thinking about an escort cruiser. Now, this program, as we all know, eventually results in the Invincible class through-deck cruisers, which are, of course, aircraft carriers. There is a debate as to whether they were ever actually called through-deck cruisers officially. My dad always swore they were, and he was actually involved in some of the design work and some of the processing. So I will believe him. But none of the documents we have yet got access to do so refer them to that way, and therefore there is a debate about it. But there again, we're talking about relatively recent times in terms of British record keeping for our national secrets and on our procurement systems. So yeah, there are all sorts of rules which hide documents. So it'll probably be later in my life, if I'm lucky, I'll be able to find out the full documentary history that has survived, if those documents do survive. But that doesn't really matter. To this scenario, what you have to consider is the British are still working on the idea of having cruisers, and there's two strands of development going through this. One is a missile cruiser, and one is a helicopter cruiser. And they're all parts of the CVA-01 project to an extent, and the whole future fleet and the ideas about that, and there's all sorts of developments and stuff going on for them. And it's all coming together about what you need to make good use of the missiles you are developing, what you need in terms of stability profile, what you need in terms of firepower. And one of the things that starts coming up from this is, do we have large enough destroyers? Do we have large enough escorts? Because, okay, if this is what your cruiser is called, you're going to need destroyers to be pretty big to be your surface action group leaders, because this is not going to be leading a surface action group. No. In the nicest way, HMS Formidable might have decided she was going to be part of the Battle of Matapan, but none of the admirals wanted her to be. And HMS Unicorn might have decided to engage in a little bit of shore bombardment in Korea, but none of the admirals wanted her to. It's bad enough you have battleships going and doing that without aircraft carriers deciding to do that, or rather forward aviation support ships doing that. So this thing, it's not going to be leading any surface action groups. And why does that matter? Why do surface action groups matter? Because surface action groups are still part of the doctrine, still there. Remember, during the Falklands War in 1982, they actually send off some of the ships as a surface action group, potentially some of the escort from the carrier battle group start maneuvering off as a surface action group to potentially engage the Belgrano surface action group. Should they need to? Should they get past a submarine? Should they not be stopped by missiles? so they maneuver so that they don't get into gun range of the carriers. There is still that doctrine going on in this period. It's very much part of the thinking still. And I know that might seem strange to us today, looking back through history and thinking about this also being the era where ships are getting increasingly obsessed with missiles and they're not having guns, they're not having those things fitted, and there's sort of that sort of time's coming up when you're going to get the Type 22 frigates, which famously the first batches don't have a deck gun fitted. They have 40mm Bofors, but they don't have a deck gun. Well, alongside all of that is percolating the ideas of we need a larger escort. We need something which is going to be the principal escort for the carriers, the principal lead for surface action groups. This vessel is going to be the lead for the ASW hunting groups, the convoy escorts. And yeah, they sort of work together. This was the idea of this sort of force of, okay, so we're going to need a carrier battle group. That's going to need a couple of these larger destroyers to lead it, and they're going to have to be quite presenceful ships. Are going to have more of them than we're going to have these things, because these are going to be filling the cruiser role of leading basically commerce protection duties. This is one of the reasons why cruiser does fit what they're talking about them. They're thinking about as commerce protection ships, in terms of ships for maintaining controlled sea lines of communication. So in our modern day, we'd be looking at something like the Hyuga class of the Japanese Navy, those sort of vessels. And as an analog, sort of. And this stuff is what's building into the Royal Navy's concept of operations. And with that also you have the development of the missile systems and various missile systems. It's not just Sea Dart which is coming through, it's not just Sea Wolf, there's also Ikra for dealing with submarines as an anti-submarine weapon system. There's Exocet, but there's also other missiles coming in for the anti-ship role. And all these things are coming in. Today we take missiles for granted, but realistically the Falklands was the first missile war, in that the powers on both sides were shooting missiles together at sea, and had the potential to do it at sea. That's the difference. We're dealing with major powers, large warships, all these things engaging, not small ships, but actual big warships getting involved in a missile fight with each other. And realistically, a lot of the stuff which is being talked about until 1982, so from about 1960 to 1982, so about 22 years, is incredibly theoretical. It's based off theory, of theory, of theory, of theory, of theory. It's exercises. And again, the Royal Navy, and I hate to say this, but the Royal Navy has a certain habit in that it likes to fall into the data traps of exercises. It gets all this information from exercises and it goes, look at all this stuff supporting it. You look, consider the 1920s and 30s, ASDIC initially. Oh, this is great. That's going. And it's only when they start doing operations which are slightly less scripted in terms of their ASDIC, they go, oh, that didn't work. Then you had the false positives of the data with guns, which had led to the guns on the Nelrod class. And then you've got the false positives from exercises when you've got aircraft attacks on ships at sea, in exercises where the aircraft all go for the carriers and the battleships and the cruisers, and ignore the destroyers. And so there are all sorts of assessments made about the guns that need to be fitted to the destroyers because of that. And that's why they don't develop really a truly general purpose destroyer gun as early as they could, because by the time someone comes in who questions that in the 1933-34 onwards, it's almost become accepted that well, no one's going to bother about destroyers if you're an air attack. You're going to go after the big meaty targets. And until someone goes, well, hang on, in an exercise that's fine because they're not running the risk of dying. But what happens when people are firing actual guns at them? Are they going to be still so keen to dive into the centre of a naval formation? And it takes a while for people to react from that and go, oh. And with the missile systems, it's the same. There's all sorts of ideas about how you defend against missiles, about what missile attack's going to be like. until you actually experience it, you're going, oh, that wasn't like that at all. And again, to use the reference of the Falklands War, we have the good example of, I think it was Captain Jeremy Black, who was in charge of HMS Invincible. I think I might have already mentioned that. And when he's under attack in the Falklands War, when they're firing the sea darts at an incoming attack, he goes fire 1, fire 2, and then he has to think. Because he's so used to exercises in only firing 2 missiles. But then he remembers they're under attack and he goes fire 3, fire 4, fire 5, fire 6. That's the difference. And there's a problem. The further you get from wars, and the further you get from conflicts which are peer versus peer conflicts. A war where your opponent can actually engage back on a level playing field. They're not an asymmetrical threat. They are a full threat. They are able to attack you asymmetrically, symmetrically, any metrically they want to. They can mount a strike on you. When you're dealing with a peer on that level, that's a very different experience. And that has to factor into your warfighting. But with all this being said, this is what the discussions which were leading to this, the Type 82. What is realistically the last big destroyer so far of the Royal Navy? Now, the thing with the Type 82s that lets them down is that they didn't come fitted with 2 Sea Dart launchers, and they didn't come fitted with a hangar for their helicopter. And to be honest, it's because the design goes through the same adaptations, the same things as happened to the Albion class, LPD, later on for the Royal Navy. In that someone very smart goes, but they're always going to be operating with a carrier, or there'll be this cruiser nearby, so why do they need their own helicopter hangar? They can just be a helicopter pad. And besides, also we have frigates and we have the counties, they'll take the helicopters. This doesn't need it. We can save money. They did have flag facilities on. In fact, arguably in 1982, the ship afloat which had the best flag facilities was actually HMS Bristol. The fact she wasn't sent down in the first wave with a Vice Admiral aboard to be the task force commander down south is something which is a whole kettle of fish different than this discussion, but is a really big problem when it comes to the command structures and implementing operations down in the Falklands. In that, for any resolution between the task group commanders when they have disagreements, it has to go back to Northolt. Because whilst a rear admiral might seem like he's in charge down there because he has the seniority, in real terms, when a task group commander is talking about a different task group commander's area of operations and it's a dispute over assets going between those 2 operations, then both are task group commanders under the command chain. And therefore that has to be solved by the task force commander, the person who's above them. If he's back all the way up in the UK, it's kind of difficult for him to provide a timely response, which means it can lead to acrimony and problems and mismanagement and other issues. Who'd have thought it? The British managing to muck up at command and control issues. Again, so many times through history. Just repeating the same thing over and over again. Anyway, with the Type 82, once you get past those small flaws of not having 2 Sea Dart launchers and not having a hangar space, which frankly, considering we are already talking about a design which was 7,000 tons fully loaded, 6,300 tons in standard, so we are talking, depending on which measures you're using, up to twice the displacement of the Type 42. Well, they're a little bit bigger to accommodate those extra Sea Darts, and that extra hangar would have been really useful. They also came with an ICRA anti-submarine system, It was also fitted to some of the Leander-class frigates, and was a fairly capable missile. To be fair, it was developed by the Australians, and it worked pretty darn well, because it would launch a torpedo 10 nautical miles away from the ship. So, if you think about the range of the torpedo, and if you think about the scenario of, okay, I've got helicopters out hunting submarines, if the helicopter is keeping contact but has managed to miss with its own weapons aboard, but they are at a range at which very soon I'm going to be in torpedo range of that submarine, I'd rather the helicopter, rather than coming back to me, keeps contact with that submarine, and I'll lob some torpedoes into the water. And again, it's a nice way of going, well, how many are you going to lob? Probably about 4. I'm not going to be controlling them. I'll just lob them in round the submarine and we'll see which one gets it. It's better the submarine is dead than I am sorry. That's what the Icarus system basically counts for. There's debates about how good it actually was, but realistically, in that scenario, it's better to have than nothing. It's a lot better to have than nothing. And I consider it actually quite useful. I consider it pretty darn useful for that. It's got a 4.5-inch gun forward, also. That's the Icarus system, and that's the 4.5-inch gun. And then it's got the full Sea Dart radar suite. The Sea Dart is basically the same as a Type 42, and I think the trouble is, that's another problem, because you didn't have the second launcher, because you didn't have the hangar deck. The Type 42 can look like an interchangeable asset. It can look like, well, they've got the same air defense capability. If you'd had the 2 launchers, if you'd had the helicopter, suddenly this becomes a far more useful asset, and it's far easier to make the case of it. It turns into a cost fight of which one is cheaper. We can, in theory, buy more hulls from the Type 42 than we can from the Type 82. The answer is the numbers tend to not so much be decided by costs as by the government's wish to keep the yards open and functioning and employing people. And that decides usually how many hulls are built. Realistically, whilst this program was unfortunately indelibly attached to the CVA-01, it was even more needed when you didn't have the CVA-01. This was the vessel which had the space aboard. You know, when we think about the Royal Navy in the 1980s and the situation it found itself in, Michael Clarke, the Commodore of the Amphibious Task Group, is commanding from HMS Fearless, which is a lovely ship, but she was never designed with flag facilities. Honestly, it's back to World War II, trying to cram a flag officer and their staff running a very complex amphibious operation and inshore littoral operation from second-hand converted under duress spaces. I think at one point, I'm fairly certain the major in command of the landing craft, Ewan Selby Taylor, was actually sleeping in a bathtub, because that was the only accommodation he could find. And realistically, whilst that makes for a lovely story, and he's a lovely Royal Marine and a really nice gent, that's not really a good way to provide some of the best facilities to operate from, is it? And the list of other things goes down and gets worse, because they didn't have the space. The only ship in the Royal Navy in 1982 which had the space, and had the flag rank space, was, to an extent, some of the counties still had the space. Some of it had been converted, some had them converted to other things. But the one which had the most space and could have facilitated a larger staff would have been. You have Hermes as well. She has some space aboard her. The Invincibles, to an extent, have space on them from their cruiser heritage. But again, it's all rather limited because, what can I say? There were two problems you'd had in that period the Royal Navy had been wrestling with. One, war was going to be over very quickly because it would go nuclear, so there was going to be no large operations to command because war would go nuclear within days, and so who can mount large operations? And two, and this was probably the most pernicious, well, all operations are going to be joint with the Americans, and they have plenty of large ships, and they'll be doing the majority of the staff work, won't they? People, when they think of things which get left on the Americans' shoulders during and since the Cold War especially, they think of things like capabilities as in hard capabilities, as in ship numbers, as in missile system and the numbers of missiles and development and those things. They're not wrong, but command and control is also a big problem, especially at sea. One of the really good things about Albion and Bulwark when they were built, the LPDs that were built to replace Fearless and Intrepid, was they did have large command facilities. Of course, those are now being sold off to Brazil, which I'm sure will make great use of them. And the Queen Elizabeth class have been fitted with large command facilities. They've got spaceship. That's the whole reason you have a second island, realistically, to make sure you have enough facilities for all the staff for higher command. Which does help. It does help. It does help the Americans, especially in task group coordination, and having another power who has that ability to do that. But realistically, that's rather limiting in that for the Royal Navy, they can be help for task group operations and maybe even task force operations should that be necessary, as long as they have one of two ships available. And realistically, the decisions do go back to CVO1, but they'd also go back to this, the Type 82. Because it was made very conservatively, and I do say very conservatively, there were options for slightly bigger designs with a second Sea Dart launcher, with a hangar, all these things for the helicopter. Usually the hangar for the helicopter was done by having a lift. They had a long enough stern and they'd have a lift, and the aircraft would go down into the lift and pop along, and so you could store a couple of helicopters down there sort of under the deck, and you'd have the lift come up and go down or something. It was worked out, and it was quite a good idea realistically. It would have been fairly helpful. Okay, yes. Does it provide you with as quicker facilities of aircraft operation as just opening the hangar doors? No. Does it provide you with aircraft that you can sustain under operations and maintain? Yes. And provides a clear firing line of sight and firing position for your missile launchers? Yes. There were options, but they weren't gone through. And it's rather an interesting thing, because if you go back to the counties, they have that. If you go back to the Darings, they have, one of the reasons why they have the structure they have is to have the space for officers aboard, for senior officers and their people to be aboard. And you have other spaces you can adapt, and eventually they lose torpedoes to command spaces and those sort of things, but that's as time goes on. All these really have been command destroyers, and this was probably one of the most explicit command destroyers and one of the most needed command destroyers. And yet, as said, they left the hangar out. They didn't fit the second Sea Dart launcher, which you'd think, again, would have been something which would come in. You could argue that maybe they decided to fit the Icar instead, but realistically, you need both. Realistically, you do need both. And having a second Sea Dart launcher and magazine forward would have been a very helpful thing for providing better protection, better all-round fire, and a better overall unit. And so why am I being more critical of Bristol than I am of the counties? Well, you see, The counties were built to be stand-ins until something better was available. Once you have the Sea Dart system, that is better available. Okay? It makes sense. The other option, of course, and this is something worthwhile considering, is that if she'd been built with a space, or actually built with the second Sea Dart system forward, then potentially she could have converted one of the Sea Dart systems to a Sea Wolf system. They could have made that change to her at a certain point. Again, it would have been useful. Sea Wolf comes in 1979 and would have been a useful asset to add on and to maybe replace a Sea Wolf launcher. It would take down her air defense capability, but give her much better defense against missile attack. Because let's be honest, Sea Wolf is the first missile system which is developed when the British are presuming, hang on, we're going to have to engage missiles coming in, not just aircraft. Sea Dart starts off in a period which is still engaging aircraft. Faster, meaner, more deadly aircraft, but still aircraft. They evolve it over time, but the original ones are very much aircraft orientated. With all this being said, though, and I realise this is probably a bonus to what was originally asked, because originally the question was about bearings to the counties. And I've gone further. Well, we're now left to the future. Now, the Type 83. The future. When I was first asked why I felt the Royal Navy was going for an 83, an 8 designation, rather than a 40 designation, continuing on, maybe going for the Type 48, which I think is what the design work was pretty much up to, and instead going for a Type 83, well, my first thought was magazine depth. You see, again, the Type 42s and the Type 23s and all of them, they're lovely ships and they make sense to an extent, and the Type 45s make sense in a world where you either expect your ships to not be around for long because you expect the war to be over quickly because it goes nuclear, or expect them to be able to run into UK ports and therefore rearm fairly quickly because they'll be operating quite close to home. Or you think wars are wars of choice, where you get to choose when wars happen, so you can decide when your ship's going to action, you can decide what length the likely war is going to be, because it's probably going to be against someone who has a fraction of your technological and military fighting power, so you can pretty much set the scene for everything. The moment those options cease to be the case, well then, you need something a bit bigger. It needs to carry more missiles. It needs to be more capable of actually providing a long-term capability for conflict, or rather, not necessarily a long-term capability we're talking about in terms of weeks or months, in terms of days. We're talking about something which needs to be able to survive multiple attacks of the enemy. We're talking about something which needs to be able to engage a variety of targets, both at sea, under sea, from the sea, and over the sea. It needs to be able to engage them all. It needs to be quite well armed. To me, the selection of the 80 as a designation was a signal that, realistically, we need to go back to the Bristols. We need to go back to the large fleet destroyer idea of the Royal Navy. And the large fleet destroyers, the counties, the darings, the battles and the tribals, that whole lineage of large fleet destroyers were, we take on everything. We will fight it all. You bring it to our doorstep, we'll fight it. That was their purpose. That was their role. And historically, 8 as a number, whether it was the Type 81 tribal class frigates or the 82 in terms of HMS Bristol, were designed as all-rounders. They were supposed to be able to gauge all threats. So yeah, it makes sense. Now there is of course discussions about what type of ship they'll be. I I've been talking about this on this channel for quite a long time, that my view has always been that modern escorts, the Type 26, Type 31s, 32s, whatever succeeded Type 45, now it's of course known to be Type 83, were going to become more and more the centerpieces of their own task groups of uncrewed vessels. And that makes sense. The uncrewed vessels, though, when we're talking about that, are probably going to be between 1,000 to 2,500 tons, maybe a little bit bigger than that, but somewhere in the range between a Flower-class corvette or a River-class OPV, to use a more modern example, and a World War II Tribal-class destroyer or Battle-class destroyer. Something on that scale. Why? Again, if you want something to operate in the centre of the Atlantic, or the centre of the Pacific, or the centre of any of these oceans, and wander around the whole world with you, it's going to need to be a certain size. Unless you are talking about having your ship be even bigger, your crewed ship be even bigger, because it's a mothership. In which case, you're basically talking about taking probably something about the size of a landing platform dock, because you're going to need something like a well deck for the uncrewed surface vessels to be able to dock into, be rearmed, and be restocked and sent back out. You're going to need something of that size and scale. Now, to me, this means that also we should be factoring into our ship designs them having personnel aboard who exist to maintain and service the uncrewed assets. They're going to be needed to do so. That's going to have to be a factor into your crew, just like you factor in your helicopter crew and personnel to support and sustain the helicopter flight. You are going to need personnel on your ship who exist to be the maintainers who might be flown out by helicopter or taken out by boat to the uncrewed vessel to go and do maintenance when something goes wrong. Because again, you're going to be operating at sea, and as much redundancy as you build into systems, you're going to need to fix them at sea occasionally. In fact, more often than not, because you see, redundancy is great because it provides you with ongoing capability. But here's the thing, if your first system has gone down, and so now you're dependent on your secondary and your tertiary system maybe, you've got a problem. Because then if your secondary system goes down, you've got one system left and you've got no backup. So basically, the moment the primary system goes down, you schedule for it to be fixed. Maybe you have a regular maintenance schedule anyway. You could do a visit to the vessel every couple of days. Someone goes aboard to check the systems manually and make sure everything's working. Perfectly sensible. And as part of that, well, they do a bit of servicing. But they fix any bits which are broken, they go and fix them. But those are personnel you're going to have to factor into your crewing manifests. And to me, that all makes sense, because the modern frigates and destroyers are becoming more and more, and have more and more achieved the size and scale of World War II cruisers. And there's a good reason for that. Because the more you want a ship to do, the bigger it's going to be. The more you want it to voyage around the world and be self-sustaining, the bigger it's going to be. Basically, if you go back through history, and you look at the size of ships which are being called upon to do the kind of worldwide cruising presence missions and task force missions that we are talking about modern ships doing as a regular part of their duties, you'd be surprised to find out that the weights stay fairly constant. I can even tell you that if the Type 83 is going to be as big as it probably is going to be, it'll probably be as big as it's probably going to be from the mission description. It's probably going to be roughly about 12,000 tons if it's built to actually do what they claim what they want it to do. If it's fitted for everything it's supposed to be, it's going to be fitted with, and it's doing the duties. It's going to be roughly 12,000 tons, maybe slightly bigger, but it's going to be roughly that. And by the way, that's probably where the American DDX is probably going to end up roughly around the region of. Why? Because A, you're needing a certain depth of arsenal, a depth of magazine, in terms of the number of missiles you're carrying with VLS, but also in terms of other capabilities you've got to have aboard you, and a variety of weapon systems. One of the things that has been used to cheat the sizing of ships over probably the last 30 odd years has been, again, the wars of choice doctrine, the overconfidence on the sort of technological supremacy. And that has meant that you haven't really fitted enough weapon systems to ships. For example, quite often you see close-in weapon systems fitted in pairs, or maybe even singly. Your insurance system, in case a missile or an air threat leaks through your air defense perimeters and is barring in for the ship, and you have one of them, or two. What happens if one of those aren't working, or if the only one isn't working? When you're designing stuff for war, you don't order in 1s and 2s. You order in 3s and 4s. Again, why? Because if one's down, you still have 2. And if you've designed the coverage right, let's say you've got 3 close-in weapon systems, and let's say they're positioned in a sort of triangle formation on the ship's superstructure, so 1 forward, 2 aft on sponsons. The ones aft can both cover aft and both cover roughly, let's say roughly 2. We'll go for roughly 220-ish degrees of coverage. One forward might have roughly the same. That means that most angles are covered by at least 2, and even if, let's say, the one at the front goes wrong, well, you don't have to move the ship over that much to make sure one of the aft ones can engage any incoming target. Same if one of the aft one goes, well, you've got coverage quite a bit from the forward one and the other aft one. What am I talking about? I'm talking about redundancy. I'm talking about, yes, the defense salesman, the weapon salesman will tell you how great their weapons are. They will tell you how great their weapons are. And under testing conditions, I'm sure they do live up to the lab results. But then salt water and reality happens. And if you look at navies through the past, they believed in how good the technology was. But just as the old saying, trust but verify, has lived for a very long time, so is the saying of, it doesn't hurt to have redundancy. It doesn't hurt to have an insurance policy. The interesting thing to me with the Type 83, and depending on how it develops and how the design goes, is going to be not just the splitting up of the VLS cells. I'm fairly certain they will end up with 2 sets of VLS. That seems to be about fairly common. The Americans have been doing that for a long time because, again, it makes sense from a redundancy perspective of if you lose a VLS magazine for some reason. And people always think immediately enemy action. Yes, it could be enemy action. It could also be something like there's an accident on the power lines are broken, or you have some sort of problem down the forward end of your ship, or computer issues. It's very nice to have a second set of VLS, so if one goes wrong, the other one's still working. And yes, people go, well, hang on, it doesn't work like Alex. Alex, the cells are divided up, there's multiple backups and all those things. And you're completely correct. But worst case scenario, if one goes wrong, if you've got one set of cells goes wrong, the other one's still working, you've got time to fix the one that's gone wrong and find out the problem. And it's a very unlikely scenario, but warships aren't built based on likely scenarios. They're built on people making the illogical choice to start a war of aggression. That's already an unlikely scenario if we're being honest, because who really wants to roll the dice of war, of conflict, of all the damage that can come from that? If you're not building a ship, you're not building these ships based on likely scenarios, so it's better to be prepared for the unlikely scenario, because that's what it's already going to be in. And I think also that's a lesson from the Type 82, I would say. I would say the Type 82, unlike the County class, did not have enough redundancy built into it. The County class had those 2 twin 4.5-inch guns, plus the Sea Slug missiles, plus other systems. And then they exchanged one of the twin 4.5s for Exocets. But they still carried how many Exocets? 4. It worked. Provide them with enough. The Daring class destroyers, those fonts of post-World War II thinking, carry three twin 4.5-inch guns. The Barrels had only carried 2 because they're built in wartime, and the 4.5-inch guns they're using, well, they're using what's called BD mounts rather than upper deck mounts, and they are the mounts which the method of mounting the guns is the same as they use for mounting on capital ships, and those are the only ones they have available, but they don't have enough of those coming through. So they use those on the destroyers, but that means they don't even carry 2. The moment they have the upper deck mounts, the lighter mounts, the mounts which are supposed to be for destroyers, the Darings have 3. The Darings have 3. Because, again, you're building a ship for war. Not for peace. Not for a theory. You're building it, so if you need it to fight a war, it can. And that's the reality. With that being said, considering all the discussion that's been on the Darings, the Counties, and the Type 82, I'd like you to write below what you think the Type 83, what you think future destroyers should be built around. What should they be like? I'd really like to hear your ideas. Maybe they'll get into the actual ideas of people actually working on these projects and they'll think about them. Maybe they'll watch this video and think about it. I don't know. I can hope they will. With that being said, what's coming up? Well, this video, I think, comes out on the 11th of October. So the next video on my list to record, anyway, is the US Naval Academy, Annapolis. That'll be a fun one. And hopefully by the time this video comes out, I have been in Japan and I have found an onsen. That's basically my entire aim for the trip, is to find an onsen and enjoy. I have 3 targets for Japan. Visit Mitsumasa Yonai's shrine, or rather dedication. Visit Mikasa. And visit an onsen. There are people who tell me that my aims for Japan are rather limited, and I go, yes they are. And that's fine by me. I'm happy with achieving those things. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and, well, take care. Thank you for your support of the channel. There is going to be also a Historiathon in November, and also there should be tickets, by the point this comes out, available for the event at King's College London in November. On the 13th of November, I'll be giving a public talk at King's College London on building for peace. How you function and factor in conflict management and risk, deterrence into ship design. It should be a fun talk, and I do think there's going to be an online version, but I'd really love a lot of people there to be there in person if they could be, because it'd be fun. It'll be really fun to see you all. Take care and have a good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you're watching this video. Take care.